Okay, can we start?
Yes, on my end, we can start.
Yes.
Whenever you're ready, Pablo.
Good morning, good evening to everybody. Here we're in a new webinar with Lidy Nacpil from the Philippines. It's already there 9 p.m. and with Nicola Haeringer in Paris, France, to discuss about, and myself, Pablo Solon, here in Bolivia. I just had my breakfast. And here we are to discuss what is happening with climate change, with nature, with biodiversity in this time of pandemic. Is it getting worse? Is there any kind of relief for climate, for nature? And the most important thing, what do we have to do? How do our strategies have to change? What do we think? So we're going to have a short dialogue among us. Each one will speak about 10 minutes around how do we see the situation, and you can ask questions through the chat of Zoom, but also through the chat in Facebook. This webinar has simultaneous interpretation to Spanish and French, plus the seminar will be in English. And it's being live streamed by our 3 Facebook pages of Global Dialogue in these 3 languages. So let's start. What is happening with climate change? No, my opinion is that we are seeing a new assault, even more deeper to nature than what we saw before. So in the case of Bolivia, we are breaking records of forest fires, even during the quarantine. So even though the economy is almost semi-paralyzed, forest fires are expanding. We have broken the records of the last 10 years, and probably we will repeat this year forest fires bigger than last year. And last year, the forest fires were around 5 million hectares. It was huge, a big ecocide. But not only this, now we have here in my country, but it's also the situation here in South America, that they want to approve new GMOs for corn, GMOs for soya, other varieties, for sugarcane. So it's GMOs for everything, because this is the way to reactivate the economy and to, in some way, compensate this paralysis that we have lived during this months. So that is the big argument of the big agribusiness. And parallel to this, we see also happening something similar when it comes to the mining sector. They are giving mining concessions like popcorn to everybody. The mining of gold has increased. So we see that we're in a much worse situation than even before. They are using that everybody, they are taking advantage that everybody is very much worried about the COVID-19 in order to advance this agenda. So we think that we need to change this, and we need to change our strategies. In a way, we need to go to the offensive, because if we only resist, as we have done it most of the time before, the situation is going to get worse. So we have to go and really deal with the structural causes of what's happening. So this means we have to go after the big agribusiness now. In our case, we're saying, oh, we don't want only to stop these new GMOs. Now we want to stop all GMOs at all. We want to discuss the role of the big agribusiness. society realizes now that health should be always a public service because health is a human right. But also food is a human right. It cannot be in the hands of these big agribusiness companies that the only thing they want is to make business, make money, get more profits. So we want to have to expropriate big landowners, redistribute the land, promote the small farmers, small peasants, communities that produce for our own consumption and not for export. So if we don't, we have to promote some kind of not only an agrarian revolution in terms of reform of the land, but also of reform of how we deal, how we relate with nature. Parallel to this, for us, it's very important in our country, we have recognized the rights of Mother Earth, the rights of nature, but they are not being implemented. But this is the moment to push even harder for the implementation of rights of Mother Earth. So we need to have this put in practice, because when we speak about GMOs, we are speaking about altering the identity of elements, of beings of nature, and we need to change that relation that we have with nature. It's clear that this pandemic has happened because we treat nature as a simple object, as a surrounding, without taking into account the problems that we will face if we deal with nature. But also, I think we need to go even further. We need to think in a new kind of democracy, a democracy that incorporates nature, because it's clear that a democracy that only is handled by humans will not address the deepest challenges that we face. We have to begin to rethink how democracy will integrate nature. And when I say integrate, it means, hey, there are different proposals that maybe we should have a special representatives elected to defend nature rights. Maybe there should be a combination with elected representatives and representatives that come from indigenous people, the scientific world, in order to have represented the voice of nature. But we need to rethink democracy, because as it is now, even if we get rid of Duterte's and Trump's and all these horrible right-wing guys, it doesn't work to address the balance with nature. And finally, what we see is that we need to have strategies maybe much broader. So before, the fight against the forest fires was mainly a fight from indigenous people, from environmentalists, but now we need to bring together almost the majority of society. It's not only an issue of the environment, it's an issue of health, it's an issue of food, and how do we link urban with rural area? How do we bring the academic world, the indigenous world, the environmentalists, the artists, the cultural activists together? Here in Bolivia, we have had an assembly to defend the forest, and we had already the third assembly, and now more than 350 have come together from all these different sectors to say, okay, we are going to act in a unified way. And now we're thinking even that maybe what we have to do, because what's happening with the Amazons, or what we call here the Chiquitania, is not only in Bolivia, it's also happening in Brazil, it's also happening in Peru. So we have to think of a much stronger articulation between these different sectors and at regional level. And of course, we have to also think at global level, because the issue of forest fires, GMOs, new agrotoxics and things like that, we are sure it's going to happen also in other parts of the world. So those are some ideas to trigger this discussion. Nicola, what do you think? How do you see it in the North? What strategies are you discussing in 350.org, in ATTAC?
Thanks, Pablo. I hope you can hear me. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. What we've seen for 2 months now is an incredibly brutal interruption or break with the business as usual, right? Planes are grounded, industrial production has been stopped or almost fully stopped, GDP is dropping, like lots of polluting industries that we wanted to shut down and convert into other types of production are shut down. So, within the climate movement, we've been calling for a decade, even more, for system change. We've been saying that from, protest to protest, from COP to COP, system change, not climate change. And we had some successes, we have made impact, but we never managed to interrupt the business as usual as it is being interrupted now. And so there are some people in the movement who are even saying, that this is somehow good news, or this is what we should strive for. Lives are being actually saved, they say, because air pollution has dropped. And so yes, people are dying because of the COVID, but lives are being saved because people don't die because of air pollution. And some people are amazed by seeing dolphins in the Bay of Venice or of Marseille in France, jaguars in Santiago de Chile, etc. And I think it's a dangerous perspective. It's a dangerous approach of things because actually what we're witnessing now is definitely not the system change that we want to see, because the system change that we want to see is embedded in justice, and what is happening now has nothing to do with justice. First, people are dying. Way too many people are dying, and they're not dying because of fatality. They're not dying because of fate. They're dying because public services have been destroyed, because the neoliberal agenda and the structural adjustment have, made everything that would have helped us prevent more deaths to happen disappear. Even in countries, so-called wealthy countries like my countries in France, we don't have masks. We don't have the capacity to test people. So the only option we had was to stay home and to be locked down. But they had then to, lift the lockdown because they wanted the economy to start again. So it's far from being just. The International Labour Organization has an estimate that more than 195 million of jobs will be destroyed because of the pandemic. And that's only in the formal sector, right? If we count jobs in the informal sector, then the job lost is even the number of jobs lost is even bigger. In the US only, I think it's 20 or even 30 million of jobs who have already been destroyed. So there's a huge social crisis with people starving, with people dying, with people not being able to pay for their rent, being able to pay for their mortgage, and maybe temporarily they're protected, but we all know that in a few weeks, in a few months, they will be evicted from homes by the landlords. So it's a huge crisis that is not only an economic and social and financial crisis, it's a social crisis, it's a health crisis. And at the same time, big corporations are leading the fight of their lives, right? Exxon, Total, like the polluting industries, the fossil fuel industry, but also the airline industries, they're fighting hard to get bailed out. They're asking the governments to pour money into the system to save them. And yes, clearly, governments are pouring money as never before, right? We are seeing the state, like creating money where states were saying before that it was not possible to create that money. But it's not poured into the same, like it's not bailing people out. It's only bailing the wrong people out. And even, even the pandemic, even the virus itself, virus is very interesting because the virus is not even a living being, right? It's not even, it's just an entity that can attach itself to a living cell, and then it will flourish from there. So it's not even a living body, a living species, but we're not we're not even equal when it comes to being infected. Those who have to keep on working are more subject to infection than those who can stay home. And we've seen that, for instance, in the US or in France. It's people of color, Black people, indigenous people of color who have suffered most from the infection because they had to keep on working. They had to take transit and to commute from home to, hospitals and other places, while the wealthy, the privileged could stay home. And that when it comes to healing from the infection, we're even less equal, right? Because some are healthier than others, and the most privileged have the means and the capacity to heal more than others. So even a virus triggers more inequalities than we thought. And obviously, the virus and the pandemic is not, a crisis that has stopped all the other crises. The virus and the pandemic are adding up to existing crises. Let's look at what happened, for instance, in Fiji 2 weeks ago. Fiji 2 weeks ago faced a hurricane. So the consequences of climate change, the impacts of climate change, have not stopped because of the pandemic. They've not stopped because industrial production is paused. They've not stopped because CO2 emissions are dropping. It continues because obviously there is a lot of inertia and the climate has already changed. And in Fiji, they had to take shelter, but because of the pandemic, they couldn't go to collective shelter. They had to shelter at home, which is a very different way of protecting yourself when you're staying home in homes that are fragile, that are not, resilient enough to protect yourself, than if you can go to a collective shelter that has been designed, and you cannot, count on your neighbors to support you because you have to maintain this, what people call social distance. So it's just adding a new layer of inequality and of operation to existing layers. And what happened in Fiji is just one example, because we know that oceans are warmer than ever, and so that the hurricane season that is going to start for the Northern Hemisphere in the coming weeks is going to be harder than ever. So in many regions, and I'm sure in the Philippines, you'll have a lot to say about it, Lidy, but the situation is going to be worse than in past years. And if lockdown goes on with authoritarian governments using that to shrink liberties, is going to be even more difficult than it used to be to fight back or to be resilient. So the situation is really far from the climate justice agenda. And if we're looking also at the, yes, greenhouse gas emissions have dropped, right? They say in Europe, they might have even dropped by 60%. 60% is where we should be in Europe in 12 years if we want to keep chances to maintain global warming by 1.5 degrees. But they only stop temporarily. And so if we're getting back to business as usual within the next few weeks, eventually at the end of the year in 2020, emissions will have dropped only by 5.5%. And if you want to keep our chances to keep global warming as close as possible to 1.5 degrees, we need to have an emission cut of 7.6% every year. So even with 2 months of lockdown, we're not going to be where we should be according to like what the international community has agreed to. And what does it mean? It means that the problem is a business as usual, right? This is what the pandemic is showing us. The problem we face is business as usual. The problem we face is fossil fuel capitalism. The problem we face is extractivism. So we need to fight. And this might very well be the moment, the fight, the moment of truth, the fight of the climate justice movement. Because if we look at, like the alternative between a carbon intensive recovery, the one that the fossil fuel industry is lobbying for, and a just recovery, the consequences will be huge. The difference will be huge, not only for years to come, but for decades and centuries to come. If we adopt a carbon intense recovery, bailing out the fossil fuel industry, bailing out the aviation industry, bailing out the iron industry, then we can give up on 1.5 degrees permanently. Whereby if we, manage to push for a just recovery, then we can pave way for just transition to 100% renewable future for all. So, so then some people are questioning, including in the climate movement, at least in the global north, the necessity to have a crisis and to have authoritarianism to get there. Right? They say it is only possible to stop production under such conditions. I think the pandemic is showing us the opposite. It shows us that there is an alternative route, which is autonomy, which is grassroots organizing, which is community-owned solutions and community-owned resilience. Governments have chosen to frame this as a war. We should frame this as care. This is about care. This is not about a war. This is about community organizing. This is about autonomy. This is about community-based resilience. I'll stop here, but together with 500 other organizations, 350 has put out a call for a just recovery, which articulates 5 principles, which are like obvious principles from our perspective, but obviously not for the neoliberal agenda. Put people's health first, provide economic relief directly to the people, help out workers and communities, not corporate executives. I don't know if you've seen, but Jeff Bezos has increased his wealth by 24 million since the beginning of the pandemic. So there are some people who are getting wealthier and wealthier on our back, even when we die, even when people, are suffering from the virus. The fourth principle is create resilience for future cities, and the fifth is build solidarity and community across borders. Do not empower authoritarianism. So I'll stop here by saying that in the movement, for quite a long time now, we've made fun of our own self by saying that it is easier for us to imagine the end of the world than the end of fossil fuel capitalism, that our imagination is fueled with movies telling us that the world is going to end, and that we are not being able to envision how a post-capitalism, post-extractivism life would look like. And I would say that this is the moment where we are being urged to build that future, where we are being urged to pave way to something very different than what we've been through, that very different from business as usual. And yes, the stakes are high, but it's definitely worth the fight.
Thank you very much, Nicola. And now we will hear from Lidy from the Philippines. Please, Lidy.
Okay. Well, I would say good evening, everyone, because as Pablo said, it is nighttime in the Philippines, but we're all in different time zones. So I guess it's good day and good night, good evening. Yes, I'm from the Philippines, and the Philippines is actually one of the countries that is enforcing very strict response measures to COVID-19. We have come to understand that lockdown and quarantine actually means different things in different countries. In the Philippines, especially in Metro Manila, which is where it's described as the hotbed of the COVID pandemic, lockdown means there are no public transportation. All offices have closed. Most are in a work-at-home mode. Workers in many factories are either being laid off or not being paid because factories are either shut down or only operating at very little capacity if they are considered, in essential service, in the business of essential services. That also means that the more than half of the labor force, which is in informal jobs in the informal sector, are not earning anything. Those who are engaged in small livelihoods find it very, very difficult because lockdown also means imposed quarantine at home where only one person per family has a pass to leave the house. And in many places, especially in Metro Manila, that means you can leave only on certain days of the week and on certain hours of those days in order to go about what they term as essential business, which is either securing food or medicines or coming in aid to the rescue of communities if you're one of the frontliners, or going to hospitals and clinics. So when we talk about the impacts of COVID-19 on people in places like the Philippines, it's much more than just getting infected with the disease or the deaths that are coming, although that's dramatic, but probably not as dramatic as in many places in Europe in terms of the per capita impacts. But most of what people are talking about is not just the health aspects, but the economic dimensions and the social dimensions of this. So economic activity is nearly down to a halt, social activities as well, and even political activities. Well, that's, I guess, the reduction in energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions and the slowdown of political activity can be classified as some of the more quote unquote positive impacts of this. Our parliament and our decision makers are not able to ram through many of the bills, unlike what Pablo was describing in Bolivia, many of the bills that are pending because they have also been hit by the pandemic. We are therefore very much agreeing with what Nico was saying, that while there are some what would term as quote unquote positive impacts of this in terms of giving the earth a rest, that's one of the phrases we often hear, but it at too much cost, at too great a cost to people, not in only in terms of health, but the displacement, the economic impoverishment and marginalization that's happening, the sense of powerlessness and helplessness. Plus, in places like the Philippines, we are also dealing with attempts to escalate authoritarianism and the barbaric use of police and military action to humiliate people who are not complying with the rules of quarantine. We have seen how people are put in cages or are beaten up by the police because they're found not wearing masks, but they only do this to people in who are obviously part of the impoverished sectors in the Philippines. So we cannot see this as having an overall positive impact, as it's dangerous to think of it this way. But we also recognize that it's an important moment that we must take advantage of to argue and fight for an economic reboot. I use the term reboot because there have also been some kind of reactions to many of our movements, maybe because we don't speak English as a first language, that recovery seems like the term recovery, although it's not the same as Nico's just recovery because it's being qualified, but the term economic recovery seems to mean that recovery is just going back to what we had before. And that's definitely not what we want, not going back to the same escalation of the climate crisis. We were on track to really breaching all the temperature rise goals, not going back to deepening inequality and the deepening impoverishment that has been taking place and the political repression that was taking place. So we do that's one of the things I think all of us speakers here agree. We do need to use this moment to take advantage, to scale up our efforts to change the system. Of course, in the immediate, that means also looking at how our strategies and our actions will have to be adapted. So that's one of the things that we are asked to address. But before that, before addressing that question, I'd like to just describe a little bit the realities for our movements here in Philippines and many parts of Asia. When we talk about people who are suffering from the impacts of COVID-19 and COVID-19 responses, we're not just talking about the people as an external or the public out there. We're talking about our members, our communities, the people who mobilize and are engaged in the struggles on all these issues. So one of the realities that we have when we talk about how do we adjust, how do we shift, is that a large part of the time of our members today have to do with survival, fighting for survival. We had a members meeting of APMDD. More than 40 organizations were represented in that electronic meeting. And we had a sharing of what they were actually doing as of that moment. This was about 3 weeks ago. And without exception, all of the organizations were involved in food aid, in mobilizing help and assistance for their own members and the communities that they organize and communities that they serve. So we need to contend with that reality. We need to incorporate that in our planning, that, you know, the first things first, is the security, the survival, the well-being of our members and our people, and we need to respond to that. We cannot just keep on talking about our issues without actually addressing this very reality that our people are facing. We need to be able to be there with them and to show that, you know, these struggles are not just things that they do and that's kept out of our discussions about our issues like climate or energy and so on. We see that there are at least 5 urgent things that we need to address in terms of adjusting our work and adjusting to the situation. I'm sorry, I'm speaking too fast. As I said, the first is to immediately respond to the need for survival and to protect the safety of people and to, you know, help them weather this situation that we're going through. And that needs to be organized as well organized as our campaigns. We need to organize these things. The second is we face in these different places the need to resist the efforts to escalate repression and authoritarianism. The third is of this question that is posed before us: how do we continue our fights for climate justice, for economic justice, the many fights that we have under this new situation? How do we work in a situation where our movements have been so severely restricted? I don't think we can anticipate that in just a matter of weeks or months we can mobilize in the same scale and way that we have mobilizing before. The fourth and the last 2 points is that under the situation of the COVID-19, it's also very important for us not to talk about just about climate justice, but also to intervene in the efforts of governments and corporations to push for an economic stimulus package or an economic recovery package that will not just bring us back, continue to perpetuate the system, but to set us back many, many years in the fight against climate change. And then lastly, we need to be able to figure out how we can build our movements swiftly in this new situation. How do we do that? How do we continue to organize in this situation when our movements are restricted and we face so many threats? So these are the things that we are figuring out today that we feel are very urgent in our agenda. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lidy. Now we're going to go to have a more dialogue among us and also to answer some comments, questions that are coming through the chat. For the participants, please, if you can use the questions and answers, that would be great. And for those that want to ask any question through the live streams, you can do it in the chat of the Facebook pages, and we will present them to the speakers here. So there is one question: how to understand resilience in socio ecosystems after this new order of the world? That's one of the questions that we have. I wanted to also react. I have seen the 5 points of 350, and I agree with them. But my question is it enough? Of course, we have to put people's health first. But in order to put people's health first, we have to recognize that we have to put also in first place the health of Mother Earth, of nature. So a strategy that is centered only on humans without taking into account that there has to be a deep shift in the relation with nature, I think doesn't really address the root causes of the problem. Because you know better than me, all this issue of the virus coming from the bats to the pangolin and to the humans, and it's not the first case, it's just one of the ways nature is expressing its deep attack. So what measures do we take into account to also have a real relief, a real rest for Earth? Because what Lidy, we all agree, there is not a real rest for the Earth, but how do we change this? What measures should be taken into account, should be in relation to nature, to biodiversity, so that we don't have only, and it's not that it's not important, a program centered in humans. I think we have to have a program that is centered on humans and also nature. And the second thing that I wanted to address is, I have heard the measures that you presented. I know that it has many things have to do with correlation of forces, but if we don't go after the bad guys now, I mean, for example, in our case, the big agribusiness, this is going to get worse. It's not only a problem of supporting the health of communities. I agree fully for community organizing and so on, but we have to promote measures to dismantle the power of the big corporations, agribusiness, through measures of expropriation, nationalization, because otherwise, I think we are always at the defensive, trying to resist at local level, but they are taking over the state with laws, policies, and with huge corporations that have enough money to implement and buy media and so on. So let's start our dialogue. We have until now this question. There is another one that's being asked. How do we confront the situation exactly of post-COVID, taking into account the economical position of the agribusiness that are warming, that are promoting global warming? So I don't know if you want to react following the same order, Nicola and then Lidy, but please feel free.
Go ahead, Nico. Then I'll come out.
Okay. I mean, I agree with all your comments, Pablo, on the limits of the call for just recovery, and I also agree with you, Lidy, that, I mean, if recovery means, you know, we're just resetting the economy but not changing it deeply, then that would be a lost opportunity or missed opportunity, I think. But that's where I think, you know, to me, it's also a question of alliances, to be honest. I think we're in a situation where it is important to build broad alliances, and that we have a unique opportunity to try and, you know, get rid of a lot of the extractive industry, not all of it yet, but, you know, like, if we don't bail out the fossil fuel industry, if we manage to, so there will be bankruptcies in some fossil fuel companies if, you know, the price of the barrel keeps being as low as it is. There will be bankruptcies in the airline industry, and those companies who are not, you know, weak enough, who are strong enough to be resilient and to survive the crisis, will be weaker. So eventually, for the first time in history, we will have the opportunity to enforce some decision on them. But for that to happen, we have to try and build broad alliances, keeping in mind that obviously at some point, it's not just about not bailing out the fossil fuel industry. It's not just about transitioning to another model of energy production, transport, etc. But that by doing so, we can trigger a bigger change. That's where I can, while I agree with all the comments and critiques that you shared on the principles for just recovery, I think we are, like, lots of people are very aware of those limits, but it's a platform to try and go beyond that. Which is also why I think whenever we are talking about, care and community autonomy, then we're also back to a relation to and with nature that is different than ours, right? And it's clear. I mean, the COVID is also a product of deforestation, industrial agriculture, and globalization. So it's also clear that, I mean, I don't think at all that this is a wake-up call, or this is the Pachamama or Mother Earth or Gaia sending us a message. But there's definitely things that we can learn from that. And one thing that we can learn from that is that if we don't change the way we feed ourselves and the way we exchange and produce goods, then we'll be weaker than we already are, and will we be subject to more crises and shocks like that. And I do think that going after the bad guys should also begin with, wherever it's possible, wherever there are enough civil liberties to do it, just sue our governments. This, like, lots of people in France have already filed, law cases against the French government for, the lack of protection. And I think it's incredibly important to do so, because, we're not in this situation because of a virus. We're in this situation because of the destruction, the methodical destruction of our health system, of our public services. So this is the responsibility of the neoliberal agenda, not of the virus.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think we need to also clarify that changing our relations with nature has been part of our agenda, part of our struggles before the virus, this pandemic and COVID-19 virus. So that is part of what we mean when we say we need to figure out how to continue the struggles that we have been waging for a long time. And that includes, in its many different expressions and forms, how we change our relations with nature. When we say in the immediate, we need to address the need to survive this period and to secure the health and safety of people, we're talking about the people who will be doing these struggles to change the relations with nature. If we don't address the situation that they are in now, and I mean, how are we build the movements that we need that would be strong enough to actually succeed in changing these relations with nature? The need, I think, to mobilize broadly is always there, but for us, we should also simultaneously, while we have these broad messages like the principles for a just recovery, we need to simultaneously also develop sharp and clear messages about a more comprehensive agenda beyond what we forge as a broad movement. So I don't question the need for broad mobilization. We signed up for that just recovery principles, but we also need to, at the same time, bring forward agendas that are sharper and clearer and more radical in terms of content. And that needs to come out. Like, for instance, in all these big mobilizations that we have, on the one hand, you need to have messages that will, inspire people broadly. So that needs to, at some point, be a little bit more diluted than some people are comfortable with. But within this sea of mobilizations with these broad messages, we will be, how do you say, neglecting to do our duty for system change if we don't carry the sharper messages, the more long-term, more comprehensive messages. So I think that's what we're also trying to do, right? So we need this broad, and then we also need, the bolder and more radical messages. At this point in time, I'm not so worried that we're going to fail in either respect. I think the bigger challenge for us is what kind of actions and mobilizations and, political pressure tactics, disruptive tactics can we do under the new situation. The restrictions in our movements for health reasons to contain the infection, the spread, etc., in many countries will be there for months. How do we can't stop our campaigning work during these months. So we need to figure out how do we do it in an as effective way or in terms of impacts as our big mobilizations had before. And then the even bigger question is, how do we scale up? No, we can't just maintain the pressure that we had before, because that clearly was not enough, even if we were mobilizing millions during global moments. How do we escalate this? How do we scale up? How do we intensify? So those are the questions I think that bothers me most, keeps me awake at night. Because I have a great belief in all our movements that, we have a lot of the answers in terms of agenda and visions and demands, analysis, but it's the tactics in terms of actual actions that we really need to contend with right now.
Thank you very much, Lidy. There are several comments and questions. Let me read some of them. Some are in Spanish. Massimo, he says, this moment is the opportunity to stop an eco-socialist revolution that needs to be global. We have to unify movements and associations under one flag. Felipe Correa says, permaculture, agroecology, and agroforestry are key words for the eco-socialist revolution that we must build together. Salve Pachamama. Another, Patricia asked, how should we confront the situation post-COVID in order that the economic positions of the big agribusiness do not promote more global warming? Marcelo Antelo from Bolivia, I imagine, says, in Bolivia, they just launched a decree to promote more GMOs. What should we expect as citizens if we will not have access to the wealth that we always had because of this big agribusiness? Ricardo Rodolfo Sender says we have to improve the social organization, including Mother Earth rights. This is a challenge. This is an opportunity, I don't see, to try to organize a global parliament, generating new practices in this time. Well, and I read one more and then I'll give you back the floor because there are many. Victor Menotti says, what weaknesses or cracks in today's capitalist system are you all seeing as a result of the COVID crisis that movements might best exploit? For example, the oil market collapse is creating new constituencies for price stability, which as Saudi Arabia and Russia produce oil as fast as they can, while also searching for an exit from their oil dependence economies, could be combined with a planned phase out of oil. What organizing opportunities do you all see? So I just read some of the comments we will read in the next round, but please, I'll pass you the floor to answer to all these different comments that, as you see, are coming. There is another one from, I imagine, from Japan, Teresa Hirakata. what are we doing in order to address the issue of GMOs? Are we contacting Monsanto? Have we tried to do, what campaigns are we doing in relation to this? So, okay, we have here a discussion. Several points are on the table. Who wants to react first to all these different comments and questions? Lidy, this time is your turn.
Yeah, well, the only thing I can say is for most of these questions, we are with you in figuring out the answers, because these questions are about how do we continue our struggles against all these threats that existed even before the COVID-19 crisis. All these fights that we have been doing even before the COVID-19 crisis, how do we continue those and do it in a stronger way, in a much more vigorous way? And that's really what's keeping us awake at night, as I said. How do we do all this? I'm sure that together we can find the answers. I mean, these were our challenges even before, and now with the addition of all the implications of the crisis, we need to figure out how we can do that. We are with you in all those issues. That's why, we're very concerned about how we help our movements now, because it's the farmers' movements, the working class movements, the women's movements, and so on that are doing the fights in the front lines of these issues. And they are the ones that are dealing with the health and economic impacts of COVID. And we need to put that as part of a great consideration for what we plan to do next in these coming months. And just to Victor, sorry. So Victor, let's focus on that in some conversations, because that's a very important question, but we don't really have answers right now. It's like this webinar is coming at a period where we are repositioning ourselves and thinking about how we do exploit opportunities when many industries and corporations are vulnerable today, and how we exploit that situation is an important question.
Nicola?
Yeah, I can only adapt to what Lidy said. The first thing is, obviously, this is a moment where I don't think anyone has all the answers, and we are also, struggling to just navigate, understand what's happening and what agency we have. But on the good side of things, and this is related to Victor's point, I think, usually a crisis is really the moment that our adversary or enemies will really use to enforce worse measures. So this is a so-called shock doctrine, right? But in that case, they're trying to do it, but they're also weaker than they used to be, and they're probably weaker than they will ever be, right? Because if they're bailed out again without any conditions, then they will get stronger. So there's clearly a big fight to lead on making sure that any measure that would support the industry should come with conditions, and very strong conditions and very strong strings attached, because that's the moment where we can eventually change, the balance of forces or the state of forces, and hopefully, try and make it lean towards our own agenda rather than theirs. But one of the key issues there will also be jobs, right? And we know that the industry is going to use and try to divide the labor and the workers movement and the climate movement as strongly as they can whenever they see that this is the last card that they so we need to build food workers front and center today more than ever, otherwise we will completely lose it. And I think and I think it's not just about the jobs from one specific sectors. If you look at the airline industry, to some extent, we can really say that's maybe the only thing where it's really good news. Aircrafts are grounded. So, yeah, it means jobs are lost in the airline industries, but it's like okay, the impact on climate is so good that maybe you could say that's good news, period. The problem is that when aircrafts are landed, it's not job lost in the airline industry. It's also job lost on like all the people who work around airports, transport to airports, sanitation of airports, cleaning the airports, you know, freight and etc. And when you add that up, then it represents millions of jobs. So yeah, it's really important to, you know, have so one of the organizing answer or approach rather than answer is to work closely, like more closely than we have ever done with local unions and yeah, build stronger alliances with workers.
Thank you, Nicola and Lidy. Another question, how does the economy has to evolve in order to take into account that we are not dealing only with resources, but we are also dealing with ecosystems? There is another question that addresses why we don't have some kind of global law to address the transition to a model of organic agroecology, and how do we overcome the limitations for political action that is already set our organizational dynamics under a very authoritarian control and push our activities to the virtual? Which are our alternatives for action in our specific agendas? Do we think that the new progressive international promoted by Naomi Klein, Noam Chomsky, and others like Correa is going to represent us? How to build a global resistance with reclaim, but to put in practice given the urgency of a radical change? So I wanted to address some of this question. Yeah, I think that we need more global actions. For example, we're not going to be able to stop GMOs here in Bolivia if there isn't a strong support in Europe against these new GMOs and in other countries. So we're not going to be able to stop the forest fires if we do not defeat the free trade agreement of Mercosur with EU, because the demand for these new products are mainly in the north, you know, or in other emerging countries like China, definitely. So I think that international articulation, coordination is key. But we need to come out with proposals, I think, more radical. I see the UN in a very deep crisis. And we should come with something, with a proposal of, wait, what do we do with this UN? It's not reacting. This is a crisis as big as probably what was World War II. It's the biggest crisis since then, and there is no real reaction. We have to come up with proposals. And I always say proposals that not only take coordination among states, but that include civil society from different states and include nature. I think that climate change, the Paris Accord, doesn't work because it only deals with the fact that, okay, we have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but it doesn't deal with extractivism. It doesn't deal with fossil fuel extraction. It doesn't really deal with forest fires. So I think it's the time to go even beyond the proposals that we had in order to address this situation. And in relation to the progressive international, I think it's very interesting to have a space to dialogue. But for example, in the case of Bolivia, we are very accepted. We don't have too many hopes because we see who are the persons from Bolivia being part of this progressive international. The same ones that brought us to this situation, because we have GMOs and forest fires because of the previous government of Evo Morales. So are we really going to change, or are we really going to unify those that have failed in addressing the key issues while they were in the government? So I leave the floor to you. I don't know if this time you want to start Lidy or Nicola.
Go ahead, Nico.
I started twice, so you have to start, Lidy.
Yeah. There were several questions. So I think I'd like to address Ellie's question, or questions, several questions. I have yet to look through the new Progressive International that's being promoted. But in general, while we are, of course, are very grateful and very much welcome prominent people speaking to a progressive agenda, we would also like to see that there is a way for voices of leaders from grassroots movements to be also speaking directly to the questions and the issues, so that we also move further away from a culture, a political culture that also exists in the progressive and left movements, where there's a lot of fuss being made about, prominent people with names and who are known. We need to be able to have a political culture that celebrates leadership from the grassroots. So that's one of the things that I would like to see in terms of how we come together globally under the new situation. Your first question about overcoming limitations for political, you really put it very well. Political action that has already set our organizational dynamics under an authoritarian control and pushed our activism to the virtual. That is precisely the situation we are in. We need to see what kind of other creative actions that we can do. One of the things which will challenge how well we are organized. One of the actions that we experimented a few weeks ago is because at that time people were still allowed to stand in front of their houses. So one of the actions we called for is for people to stand in front of their houses and that be a demonstration of, and you can see that within communities and so on, a demonstration of people's protests. Not quite the substitute for our big mobilizations, but still it is one step closer to having some form of expression of protest. And the first time we experimented, it didn't actually command as much attention. The second time, that provoked arrests. And so it kind of, brought it home that not only do we have to be creative, we have to be daring. Yeah. If we get arrested for simple things like that, well, that's the reality and we need to face that. It brings me back to when I was a student and we were trying to break through the terror of martial law and how do we organize actions. You do a picket of 10 people, you get arrested. You keep doing it, you kept getting arrested, but you keep doing it until the dictator got tired of arresting us because we kept doing it. So, I mean, this is some of the things that we need to deal with. How do we break through this imposition of restrictions, while of course at the same time taking care that we are also mindful of health now? So but big question is, how do you do actions with social distancing, for instance? So there's a lot of things that we need to reflect on at this moment, I think.
Thank you, Lidy. Nicola?
Yeah, that's a very important question, right? Because I mean, lockdown has been imposed on us in half of the world. At least half of the world population has experienced lockdown, and there is no place in which lockdown has been, decided on an empowering basis, which could have been an option. I mean, there was an option for governments to say, we need to care for one another. This is about it. So we'll lock us down, but we would stand in solidarity with one another. That could have been an option. Well, not from governments, but locally, we could have, had that option. They decided to opt for another route. And in many countries, it comes with heavy militarization or politicization of the lockdown. In France, for instance, 5 people have been killed by the police during the lockdown period for, just walking down the streets, and obviously none of them were white. It's people of color, so it's another instance of like politicization, structural racism, and so on. And the problem is not just about the lockdown. It's because lockdown was imposed on us that way. The lifting the lockdown is also imposed on us, and is also tackling our autonomy and disempowering us. So I think it's also very important to begin there and to resist to the way lockdown is imposed on us and to the way the lockdown is lifted. So to refuse, all the devices and tools of control that big corporations and governments are trying to impose on us, like apps and the necessity to check, etc. It doesn't mean we should, go out and get back to our hug people in the streets. It should be driven by care. So maintaining, all the social distance, the physical distance that's necessary to care with one another, but fuel it with solidarity, fuel it with support to our neighbors, to our community, etc. That's really important, because it's not just about resisting the existing situation. It's about grasping and taking back ownership of what is happening currently. And we've been kind of evicted from our own lives and our own choices when we've been pushed to stay home, and we need to fight back against that. I think that's one of the first steps also towards building something that is going to be very different than what we had before.
Well, thank you very much. We have reached our time. I just want to say that one good thing about this lockdown, for example, was that we were able to have an assembly in Bolivia with 350 participants of all over the country, something that before we weren't able to have, and it didn't cost almost nothing, with participants from all regions, indigenous people, environmentalists, institutions. And so I would say that there is the beginning also of a new way of interconnection and interaction. Of course, we cannot do what is very traditional, that is to go and do protests in the streets, but the protests through social media have had an impact here in the country, because if you have so many people sending the same messages in social media, then of course authorities, governments, big agribusiness companies have to react. So I think we need to see the new ways in this new situation. So I want to thank you. If you want to address last words, Lidy, Nicola, to say bye to our audience that has followed us through Facebook and through Zoom, please, your last words, Lidy, Nicola. Lidy.
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you. I know there are more than 40 participants who join us tonight or today, and thank you for joining us. Next conversation, we hope to hear from others. Those of you, these ideas that we are reflecting on, these questions we've been reflecting on today, I think we really need to have a wider conversation, as we can learn a lot from each other. I'm feeling upbeat because I can see in our movements the hope that we have, even though we're going through very difficult times, because people are so keen, not just to survive, but how do we continue with our work? That's, I think, a very good starting point for working together.
Thank you very much, Lidy. Nicola?
Well, I think what you said, Pablo, like assemblies, that's also one of the things we should really do, multiply conversations and maybe take advantage is maybe not the right word, but use this moment where we are forced to stay, in a small circle, not very far from home. Use this as an opportunity to multiply conversations assemblies and organizing at the local level, because we know that this is, eventually what will last, whatever happens, whatever the shocks to come. So thank you very much for having me on this call. It was really interesting, and I'll definitely tune in and listen to the next ones.
Well, thank you very much to Lidy and Nicola, and to all the participants that have followed us through Zoom and also through the 3 different Facebook pages. There are several comments that we weren't able to address, but we will try to share with the panelists and have maybe written responses. Please follow our website that is globaldialogue.online, and follow our Facebook pages. This conversation, also in the 3 languages, will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. So we will be continuing next week with another global dialogue. Thank you very much to all of you, and see you next week.
Thank you, everyone.